Hey, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon to those of you in Europe, or good very late night to the few who may be watching from Asia or Australia. My name is Andrew Kennedy, and I will be giving you a talk on some recent tropical cyclone damage. This will be both from my own experience and just an overall view of what's happened over the past decade, both my work and other people's work. I will be concentrating on the Atlantic basin because there's only 20 minutes and I don't want to go over time, but we'll see what's been going on there for the last decade. And on the front page is the Hurricane Delta, which is going to make landfall Friday after this talk at some point. I'm recording it on Thursday, and it's been a very active season. On that, this graph shows the number of named storms in the Atlantic Basin for 2011 to 2020, with the yearly values here and the 30 years prior average. We can do the same for the number of hurricanes, total hurricanes, and for the number of major hurricanes category 3 or more. So when you look at this, the named storms are well above average. The red dashed line compared to the black line. Hurricanes and major hurricanes fairly near the 30-year average, and 2020 has been quite active, but major storms is around average. So there's a fair bit been going on. Now, in this past 10 years, there have been some very bad storms. I'm listing some of them here. I could have listed others. I didn't because of space. We're going to look at case studies, very quick case studies of some of these, and then try and take away some larger things. And the picture here just shows Mexico Beach after Hurricane Michael in a neighborhood that used to have a lot of houses. The red shows storms we're going to look at. I'll be concentrating on the last 5 years with one notable example, Hurricane Sandy from 2012. Let's start with that. So, Hurricane Sandy. It was not a strong storm by wind. At landfall, 70-knot winds, which is not that strong. It had a unique track. I first typed very unusual. Now I changed it to unique. There's never been a track like that before and never since. Quite high damage, not because of the high winds, because it didn't have any, not because of the high storm surge. The storm surge was high but moderate, but because it was in a very well-developed area. New York, New Jersey are very highly developed, and any damage there is very bad. So lessons from this: moderate surge can be catastrophic in well-developed areas, and we cannot predict everything. Jumping well ahead to Hurricane Matthew in 2016, so 4 years ahead, it was a Category 5. It made landfall at max Category 4. The worst effects were in Haiti. It made landfall on the Tiburon Peninsula. And here, the wind damage was very, very bad. Wave and surge damage in many places was high, and there was severe inland flooding. Haiti has very steep topography, and flash flooding can come everywhere. Now, some of the things that were most notable for me about this storm is there's a very clear example of how vegetation can diminish wave damage. Two similar buildings, same construction type, slightly different locations. The one on the left had all the walls destroyed, all the columns destroyed, reinforced concrete with masonry infill. The one on the right was behind this thick vegetation and did much better. You can see the one on the left, everything was knocked through to well past the building. And you can even see this was a more quiet area. So very much reduced damage. Also high run-up, which exceeded 8 meters. Here it's 5.7 meters. This is a hill close-ish to landfall. You can see it's a steep hill, and run-up was high everywhere. Jumping to 2017. Hurricane Irma was a Category 5, and it was terribly destructive, mainly through the Caribbean, Barbuda, St. Marta, British Virgin Islands, US Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Bahamas, Turks and Caicos, Cuba, and then it finished off in Florida, where it was also pretty strong. The wind damage, I'll say here, was catastrophic. Wave surge damage high. Inland flooding also bad in places. And Irma and Maria, which just followed it, were two halves of a pair that should be really considered together when looking at their effects. Both of them had extreme winds. One thing I'll say is that infrastructure is fragile and region-wide recovery is different, particularly when you have a lot of storms. But I'll talk about that in just a second. The second half of the pair, Hurricane Maria, came a short time later in 2017, also a Category 5. Many other places were impacted. This shows a photo from Dominica, not the Dominican Republic, but Dominica, which is an island you don't hear about very much in international news. Its takeaways, Maria's takeaways, are very similar to Irma's. One thing noted from both storms is that infrastructure can be fragile. And once it's down, it takes a long, long time to get back up. And it was made worse in these storms by the fact that many islands had bad damage, and this impeded region-wide recovery. It got much, much worse because the island that you thought would give aid had problems itself, or it was giving aid to somewhere else. So recovery is not just island by island, it's as a region. Moving on to 2017, 2017 was a very bad year. Hurricane Harvey. It was a Category 4 storm at landfall, 110 knots maximum. It made landfall in Texas near Port Aransas, Corpus Christi, which here's a map, and it's actually way down here. I'm not even showing this. The wind damage was very bad. The wave and surge damage was only moderate, even though the waves and surge were bad, and that was because the worst effects were found in areas which had very few people and very few buildings, on barrier islands where the main activity was ranching, or uninhabited areas. Now, Hurricane Harvey was the #2 storm by damage in the US history, after Katrina, which was #1, of course. And the reason was for inland flooding. And this is the only thing I've given the apocalyptic level to. Hurricane Harvey had maximum rainfall of more than 60 inches, which is 1.5 meters. It was probably more than that in some ungauged areas, but can't be proved. The areas, very significant areas, had more than 40 inches or 1 meter of rain. This was right around Houston, which is a major city. It is a flat major city. It is a fairly congested flat major city. And of course, you had very bad damage, terrible things going on. This brought it to #2 in the US. This happened because the hurricane stalled. It came down here, went inland a little bit, and seemingly just hung around forever, dumping rain in the exact same place, it seemed, until it finally left and went into Louisiana. But this was very bad news. And there are signals that this could be a sign of climate change, this increased rainfall. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Okay, 2018, very next year. The case study here is Hurricane Michael. Hurricane Michael made landfall in Florida as a Category 5 storm. It was Category 5 for less than an hour, just before it made landfall, and then started decreasing. By central pressure, it was #3 in the US history. In the area where it landed, the Florida Panhandle, it was by far the strongest storm ever. And the wind damage was very severe, catastrophic over the entire region. The waves and surge, which I actually haven't talked about that much lately, they were also catastrophic, and we have some very nice case studies here. So this picture shows the area of Mexico Beach, Florida, and each red asterisk is an individual structure that was slabbed or destroyed so that only its foundations were remaining, like one of the first pictures I showed in this talk. And the pink area right here with the X, it's the X zone, which is right here, and it's a little hard to see, but it underlies a lot of these red areas. And what the X zone is is on the FEMA flood maps, it is the area out of the 100-year storm limits. And it can be a little more fancy than that, but essentially when people live in the X zone, they believe that they do not have any real storm risk. They are not required to buy insurance for storm surge and waves, and few of them do. Yet they had terrible problems. So out of the 100-year flood zone is still very dangerous. And we also saw some very nice examples of good design being rewarded. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute or two. Okay, moving on to 2019, Hurricane Dorian. It was an enormously strong storm. 160 knot maximum winds, which is just under 80 meters per second, 185 miles per hour, which is seemingly unimaginable. It made landfall on Great Abaco Island, Bahamas, and Grand Bahama Island. Great Abaco had the town of Marsh Harbor. Marsh Harbor, after Dorian, was non-functioning in any way. Nothing was open, nothing worked. Almost all buildings were severely damaged. A large number of them were completely destroyed with nothing left. Larger numbers still had damage enough that people may not have ever recovered, recovered. It was very, very bad. Marsh Harbor is a harbor, it's sheltered, yet still we saw run up to 8 meters above sea level, as shown on this hill. There's a nice clear run-up line. And this is not something that is expected. It also Dorian had very bad impacts on the less wealthy people in Marsh Harbor. This is a satellite photo that shows the area called the Mud, which is near the harbor. The harbor is over here. And it looks like a horrible jumble, and it starts to make a little more sense, but not much, when you see that these long things, these are shipping containers that were removed from the harbor by the waves and storm surge, transported to here with everything else imaginable in terms of junk. And this whole area became just a giant debris nesting ground. There were houses here, mainly illegal immigrants to the Bahamas, many of them Haitian, lived here. They did very, very poorly. They had poor resources to begin and even less after. So the economic and socioeconomic impacts on the poorer people was much, much worse. Even the rich people had bad things, but the poor classes had very poor outcomes here. Getting to 2020, we get to Hurricane Laura. And Hurricane Laura, right here, this is, as of when I speak, this is almost the same track that Hurricane Delta is predicted to have. We'll see. I'm doing this one day before landfall approximately. Hurricane Laura, which may surprise some people, was the strongest storm ever to make landfall in Louisiana, stronger than Katrina. Katrina was stronger offshore, but it decreased in strength a little before landfall. Hurricane Laura had quite large waves and surge, but it had low to moderate wave and surge damage, and you might ask how that is. And that is because this area I'm pointing at right here, which had the largest waves and surge, had very few people in it. There were some houses, and then parts of it were a wildlife refuge. And so the worst things that happened to the birds, which I'm certain they didn't like, but not so much to people. The surge in the area up here where more people lived was considerably lower. Now, if the track had been over here, we would be revising our statement. But because it hit the wildlife refuge and the track did not make landfall here, it wasn't so bad. Now, the wind was very bad. The red areas right here in this graph show the region where the wind strength was above the 700-year ASCE design speed. This is a graph from Applied Research Associates, who did a very good job at analyzing the effects. And you can see that it was well above the design speed in some regions, which is kind of surprising because it was a 700-year design speed. So this was really a severe storm. Okay, getting to some overall thoughts. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about implications and then go on a little bit of a rant and then bring it all together. So there were some very bad storms. One thing I'm going to take away is that poor design was punished and good design was rewarded. The poster child for this is the Sand Palace house in Mexico Beach. You look at this and it looks perfectly fine. If you look really close, you can see a little bit of damage, and if you look really, really close, you can see it doesn't have utility connections. But the area around it was mainly slabbed to foundations, and when we came to visit, the owner was sitting right up here, having a drink, sunbathing in his shorts, while around him, people with bulldozers were digging out, carrying bricks from the remains of their houses and so on. The reason is because he designed his house very, very well, and it was rewarded. However, he didn't have any infrastructure. He had no town electricity, no town water, no town gas, no town sewer. He actually had his own solar cells because that's who he is. But infrastructure limited recovery. If you wanted to have a business, you didn't have a whole lot to run your business on. One thing I will say is that the cellular phone service actually came up very quickly and had very good coverage. They were by far the best and most resilient infrastructure anywhere around. Effects of climate change. I've looked at this, and my take is that for strength and numbers, it is difficult to say conclusively, particularly for the strongest storms that may change in the future. But right now, it is hard to sort out the signal from the noise. Relative sea level rise is clearly going to increase risk. For rainfall, the signal may be stronger. I showed Harvey because it was such a monster storm, but there were several other hurricanes with very bad rainfall, particularly in North Carolina. And the signal may be stronger here. And people have looked into this, and it may be an early indicator of climate change that is more robust than pure strength, because strength is just affected by so many things. However, I will say, this is where I get a little bit of a rant, is that most places aren't even designed for the present climate. So climate change, if you're not designed for the present climate, it doesn't matter too much. 100-year return period coastal designs. In the US, we generally design things to the 100-year storm elevation. This comes from FEMA originally, but follows everywhere else. And this is lower than is used for other engineering design. Wind, earthquake, tsunami, all much longer. The structure has a 70-year typical lifespan. This is from Spencer Rogers. We've got at least a 50% chance of one design event. This is not good. We can look at it this way. So here's a structure lifetime, 10, 100, 1,000 years. Here's percent chance we're going to exceed it, 0, none, and 1, 100%. So we're right at 50% with the 100-year design, which is typical. Wind brings us down here under 10%, and seismic, earthquake, tsunami, well under that. There are reasons you can't evacuate from seismic. You don't have any warning, so it has to be larger than that. But the gap between coastal and wind is real, and I'm not sure it should be there. So lessons I'm going to take away for the next decade. The first thing is that design levels should be appropriate to the hazard and the consequence. My personal opinion, which is shared by some people but not all, is that the 100-year design level is too low and offers too high of a risk of exceeding your design conditions. It depends what you're looking at, but for many things, I think we should go higher. Non-coastal, I think we need to consider inland flooding more. It's getting worse, and it's exacerbated by development. And the last one is that, second last one, even if some structures survive, infrastructure can limit recovery. We saw that with the Caribbean Irma Maria. Sandy had terrible infrastructure problems in areas that were otherwise fine. And this is, again, very common. The last thing I'll say is that a personal opinion is that wave runt can be really high and strong from my observations. This just shows an example, not in the Atlantic, from Typhoon Haiyan. A 77-ton boulder was pushed around at 13 meters ground elevation. If you were to stand there, you'd look there and say, no possible way anything could get up there, and you would have been wrong. So with that, I will finish up and I will take any questions. Thank you to everyone who's worked on this and to the generous sponsors.